Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. How can a play about rural Norway in 1882 help us process the trauma of the COVID pandemic? That's the question posed by Theater of War Productions, which is hosting readings of An Enemy of the People by Henrik Ibsen, and is then leading intense community conversations immediately following the productions. In this play, a local doctor discovers that his town's baths are contaminated and then tries to bring the news of this danger to the public's attention. It does not go well. The baths are critical to the local economy, and the doctor's persistence and attitude leads him to be branded an enemy of the people. Bryan Doerries is the artistic director of Theater of War Productions. He adapted An Enemy of the People and brought it to audiences in Washington, D.C. in late February, with shows planned in rural Ohio for April 6th and 7th. Today, he speaks to Dr. Josh Sharfstein about how this old Norwegian play speaks to the trauma experienced by the public health field, as well as community members during the pandemic. Just a note that our listeners are encouraged to watch the Ohio productions live via Zoom and then participate in the conversation afterwards. Again, that's An Enemy of the People live from Ohio on April 6th and 7th. You can sign up for free under the events tab at theaterofwar.com. Let's listen.
Bryan Doerries, thank you so much for joining me today on Public Health on Call. I'm going to talk about Enemy of the People, a play by Henrik Ibsen from 1882, which you have been staging some readings of as part of Theater of War Productions. And maybe start by explaining to our audience what Theater of War Productions is.
Thanks, Josh, for having me on the show. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Theater of War Productions is a social impact company that uses theater and a variety of other media to engage communities in conversations about challenging, sometimes divisive topics of public health and social justice. We've been around for almost 16 years, and we have over 30 projects that all present readings or performances of seminal texts, usually with some distance between the audience that we're performing it for and when it was written, as a way of mediating and creating the conditions for dialogue. We got our start with the U.S. military and in hospitals and prisons, facilitating dialogue, with populations that had experienced trauma, loss, moral injury. And that's grown to encompass all kinds of other communities of trauma or professional communities that, for various reasons, compartmentalize their emotions and trauma.
And going to one of your productions is a little different than going to the theater because the audience isn't just sitting there watching the whole time.
So in our model, the audience is the main character. It was really a construct of the late 19th century, I think, with the advent of both the cinema and electrified light, that we plunge audiences into darkness and control light in those spaces to create what we call naturalism or even realism. And we've come to think of that as what happens in the theater. But of course, for thousands of years prior to that moment, audiences were illuminated in myriad other ways. Of course, going all the way back to the ancient Greek amphitheater from which we started, a lot of the work that we perform are ancient Greek tragedies, where people sat in the open air in an amphitheater. And the word amphitheater in Greek means the place where we see in both directions. And in many ways, Theater of War Productions is trying to recreate that amphitheater everywhere we go, the place where I see you and you see me, and where we see ourselves reflected in the stories that we perform, and maybe we see the roles that we play in our own lives in the plays that we perform, and maybe step back and interrogate the roles that we're playing in our lives. And so the real theater, the real performance isn't what happens on stage in our model, it's the discussion that we catalyze with the performance. And so the discussion lasts longer than the performance in our model. It's not an afterthought, it's not some ancillary academic or artistic exercise. Everything is in service of a conversation that wouldn't have happened had we not performed, in this instant, Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People.
So you have a play, you have a conversation afterwards, and you particularly focus on trauma. So Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People. First of all, why did you choose this play?
An Enemy of the People speaks to our present challenges in really remarkable ways. It's a play about polarization. It's a play about the tension between a class of experts, scientists, and the general public. It's a play about public health and environmental disaster. It's a play at its core about the challenges of living up to the ideal of a democracy in a corporatized nation, in a nation that has all kinds of corporate and economic interests that run against the grain of the spirit of democracy itself.
So let's maybe just remind our listeners of the plot. We have done a podcast on this a long time ago. In the midst of the pandemic, we did a podcast talking about this as a literary work. There is a doctor, Dr. Stockman, who discovers that the baths of his town, this rural town in Norway, are contaminated. And he at first thinks of himself as a hero to the town because he has recognized this health threat and is going to save the town. And he very excitedly tells people, including his brother, the mayor, who immediately recognizes the economic threat that this diagnosis poses to the town. And from there, things don't go so well for the doctor.
Yeah, in some ways also, I think it's worth noting that the doctor becomes his own worst enemy. And that's an important part of the plot because the very doctor that many of us in the audience are rooting for as the plot progresses, we end up being insulted by and undercut by and disturbed by some of the things he says and does.
As he finds that people aren't ready to shut down the baths because of the economic consequences, he gets angrier and more frustrated, not just with the public officials who aren't, allowing him to speak, but frankly with everyone in the town. And in doing so, alienates people quite profoundly.
Absolutely. And of course, the play is much about Dr. Stockman's desire and quest to convey the truth to the public about the source of their water being poisoned, as it is about the role of government and of the media in the town, the small town newspaper, in distorting the truth for various reasons. Some perfectly legitimate, like the real economic pain that this truth represents, and some not so legitimate. One of the things that drew me to the play is that I'm interested in tragedies as a form. And I would define tragedies as stories about people who learn too late. And in this instance, and ancient tragedies we perform regularly are stories about people who all believe they're right. And that's one of the reasons they're tragic, because someone ultimately dies because everyone believes they're right. But in this instance, in this play, which is what makes it so modern, is it seems to me that almost everyone in the play, except for Dr. Stockman, knows they're wrong and pursues it as doggedly as if they were right. And I think that's the condition in which we live in the modern world. I think we cannot be naive about the fact that corporate interests, special interests, certain powerful lobbies and political organizations may not have the best interests of the people in mind, and yet they have tremendous resources and capacity to distort the messages and the truths offered by those who may or do, like scientists. And it's a tension that we're living with in our society. I would argue it's partially the reason that 1.1 million people died during the pandemic.
Right. And during that period, hundreds of health officials were fired or quit, pushed out of their jobs, maybe not explicitly labeled an enemy of the people, just like Dr. Stockman is, in fact, by the end, no longer the savior of the town, but an enemy of the people. And therein lies the trauma, perhaps, you're trying to unearth for people to look at a little differently through the play. I want to ask you about your production. So this is a reading of 2 acts of the play. Tell us about the actors you have.
So in our recent production, we had David Strathairn playing Thomas Stockman, the doctor. You may know David from Good Night and Good Luck or Lincoln or any number of other films, Nomadland or plays. And then a crew of other theater of war productions, like core actors that included J.O. Sanders, Brian F. O'Byrne, Peter Francis James, Frankie Faison, who was on The Wire, and many other shows, Catherine Irby from Law and Order. These actors are part of a much larger company of over 200 actors, who many of whom are well known and acclaimed, who choose to do this work. And working with them is like working with seasoned jazz musicians. You hand them the script and they improvise. So that was one end of the spectrum of the actors we employed. The other end was that we want, because the fourth act, the act that we performed, one of the core of the two acts we performed is a crowd scene. We decided that for these performances, we wanted to cast members of the public health community, journalists, and other stakeholders. So we had a nurse, we had FDNY EMS professionals, we had a number of other stakeholders playing members alongside the public health leaders of the angry mob.
And full disclosure, I was one of those people in
Yes,
the
you were.
audience, given a couple lines. One of my lines, I will tell you, was throw them in the river, where I was saying that the health officer should be thrown in the river. My mom came up to me afterwards and said she was very proud that I got mine correct.
My mother was there too. So on the one hand, to your point earlier, yes, we are definitely trying to frame a conversation that helps those who worked in public health, who weren't able to save 1.1 million people during the pandemic, process and heal from the moral suffering of having, in many ways, their hands tied by these various forces we've already mentioned. On the other hand, I'm glad we're doing this on a podcast about not just public health, but other subjects. I think what the play drives home in the modern world in the 20th and 21st century is that it's not enough to be a scientist. And one of the things that goes along with science sometimes is a kind of, let's be clear, like this myth that one doesn't have to be socially aware of oneself in the world. Not to mention the sort of godlike stature that we accord to physicians in our culture. And that's kind of a recent phenomenon. It's also an exercise in interrogating how we got here and how we can ensure that it doesn't happen again, and how we make changes to how we communicate about science and about in this environment of distortions and lies and corporate interests and governments and media outlets that will inevitably be an obstacle to conveying the truth to the people.
So you performed this twice in Washington, D.C. I think it'd be fair to say it was a crowd that was very familiar and very sympathetic to public health.
Yeah.
But that's not the only place you're going to perform this.
Yeah, so next on the tour schedule is we're taking it to Knox County, Ohio, which voted 72% for Trump in the last election. And there we have a mixture of townspeople and community members. The Republican mayor of the town is playing Mayor Stockman in the play. And we have professors from local Kenyon College, which is kind of an elite institution, including an epidemiologist who's now president of Kenyon College, Julie Cornfield. And then we have people who are vaccine hesitant, maybe anti-vax, who are going to be part of, if not the performance itself, some will be in the performance, but definitely a sizable majority of the crowd.
And you want the crowd to be engaged. That was pretty remarkable.
Well, as you said, you had a few lines that were scripted. My hope with all of our productions is to break the play. We have all kinds of other performances where that's achieved through other ends, but in this production, we break the play by giving the audience full license during the crowd scene to participate and to ad-lib whatever they feel like ad-libbing and speaking. And at both performances at Johns Hopkins and NAS at National Academy of Sciences, we heard really, some people gave themselves more lines than you had. And we knew it was working because people felt compelled to do that. I guess in my experience of doing this for 16 years,
for sure,
the interpretation of the story is really what we're after. And if the interpretation begins from within the performance by people in the audience, then we've already sort of started the discussion in a way.
Well, I think that I obviously came to the play with a lot of thoughts on the public health side, a lot of sympathy and empathy for public health officials like Dr. Stockman. But, the play is complex. And one of the things that it led me to think about, and I said in the discussion, is how the righteous cause of public health can be perceived as self-righteous sometimes. And I left thinking not so much about the vindication of public health, but just the challenge of pursuing public health and the complexity. And while I don't necessarily think there are public health officials out there saying some of the more outlandish things that Dr. Stockman says, I do think that there are people who perceive public health that way. And it really made me think about some of the challenges that public health has in connecting to people. I wonder when you go to Ohio, whether the reverse might be true, if it's a different kind of audience, whether just like I wound up with more understanding, at least in my mind, more at some level of the opposition public health has faced. I wonder whether people will maybe rethink some of their frustration with public health if they see this play. I mean, that to me, I think I'm going to try to tune in. We're going to talk about how people can tune in.
Sure.
But that's kind of what I'm looking for. And again, I'm looking for less the production than the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the goal. Just to finish the thought from earlier, on the one hand, we are trying to help public health leaders and officials process their trauma. And trauma sounds hyperbolic, but it's not. I don't think when you talk about feeling a responsibility for human life and knowing that you lost life and that you were complicit in a system that wasn't able to achieve its goals fully, that you were part of a system that didn't live up to its full potential for all the reasons we've outlined. The flip side is the economic hardship in rural America is real. You know, the pain that people felt during the pandemic around the lockdowns was real for many of these communities. But I think the thing that is even more painful, and I would argue even, if not traumatic, a form of moral suffering, is feeling ignored or betrayed or belittled or invisible. And until we address that pain as real pain, just like we're addressing the pain of scientists and physicians, until we acknowledge that pain is pain, I think it's going to be hard to bridge the divide. And yes, my hope is that people will feel validated by being part of the process and being part of the story, and also step back from their positions and question them and step back from the roles they typically play and engage in some thought about their role and how all of this goes down. And so that's the hope. It cuts in both directions. We often say that the goal of our work is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable, borrowing from an old newspaper adage. And I think that's right. You can do both at the same time. You can find comfort in validation, but you can be afflicted by seeing yourself in a more objective light through the play.
I know we had, I think, more than 1,000 people watching online. And so
Oh, yes.
How do people watch these Ohio productions online? And by the way, you gave people a chance to ask questions via Zoom too. So how do people do that?
Yeah, so we moved to Zoom during the pandemic, which revolutionized our reach and work. And so almost all of our events are streamed on Zoom or broadcast, but not streamed in one direction, because as you indicate, you are a member of the audience if you're watching, and there is a raise your hand button on your screen on Zoom webinar. And if during the discussion you feel so moved to participate and answer one of the questions I'm asking the audience, how does this resonate with you? You could end up on the screen and engaging with the live audience in Ohio. And we're encouraging people who came to the previous events in DC to come to the Ohio events virtually, or some people are already saying they're driving to be part of those events in Ohio, because that kind of cross-pollination of audience is exactly what we're after, that kind of mediation. So to attend, I think the easiest way is just to go to our website, which is theaterofwar.com, spelled the American way, THEATER of war.com. And on the events section at the bottom of the homepage, you'll find the listings for the two events on April 6th and 7th. And there you can sign up to receive a Zoom link. And there you can tune in that night on the April 6th, and the afternoon is April 7th. For that performance, we've confirmed David Strathairn again to play Dr. Stockman, and two terrific actors, Elizabeth Marvel, who's been in shows like Homeland and films like Burn After Reading, the Coen brothers film, and Bill Camp, who's an incredible actor, who's the co-star of The Night Of with John Turturro on HBO and many other films and Broadway turns. They're joining a group of local community members, including the Republican mayor of the town and the director of the library in Mount Vernon, who's playing Morton Kill, and some students from Kenyon College and from Mount Vernon Nazarene University, a Bible college that's in town as well. And so it'll be more of a composite group with some of our actors supporting them. All of our work is free. We don't believe that we can have conversations about human suffering that are transactional. So you'll never have to pay to go to one of our events. As I said before, they're all accessible live on Zoom for the most part. So we welcome people to attend.
Now, I understand that sometimes you post the videos afterwards, but it's a special experience to watch it live, isn't it?
It's live, it's ephemeral, it's in the moment. And in fact, one of the reasons we want it to be live is that there's a risk proposition that we're all sort of participating in. Either if you're in the room or you're on Zoom and you're raising your hand, we're all taking the risk of being in this space and of staying in this space together, even if it gets really uncomfortable. And that can't happen when you're watching a recording in quite the same way.
Well, Bryan Doerries, thank you so much. We're going to put all the information about these live shows in our show notes so people can join. We hope you get a lot of Public Health On Call listeners tuning in. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Josh. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Ceciri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Ceciri and Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.